we've talked about this topic a lot. I
Way
mean,
too much.
this topic is actually like one of the reasons why we even talked about doing the podcast together.
Right.
And it really was from the origination that you and I have such great conversations together. But it's also that, we start on a line of thought and then expand from there. So today's episode is going to be all about surrender. But it wasn't just about surrender.
Right.
We're also talking about surrender versus giving up.
Yeah. I mean, the difference between them, and like you said, we've talked about it so much. And it's so funny because even, after leaving our Life and Leadership Coach graduation, we asked so many people there about like this topic. What's the difference between surrendering and giving up, right? And then I went home and continued to have this conversation around surrendering and giving up. And like every time I would mention like the Mindrise podcast, they'd say, like, what are you going to be talking about? I said, well, I know we're going to be talking about surrendering versus giving up. And I'd be like, by the way, what's the difference to you? So I've had this conversation with so many people, and like in that conversation, I realized that depending on how a person was brought up, what their belief system is, I've seen differences between gender of how these answers,
right,
like
age.
Yeah, like so many different factors and how they defined surrendering and how they defined giving up, that it made me question, when we originally had this conversation, like, well, what does it mean? So I'm curious, like, what has come up for you since we've literally been on this topic for months now?
Well, it's funny because this inquiry actually started for me probably about a year, maybe even a year and a half ago. When you're in like COVID, you're in this like time warp where you're like, what's my name again? But this inquiry started for me a while ago because I tend to have a default in my response. My way I take action can tend to be a bit of the masculine variety. And when I say masculine, it's really about like the secure the perimeter, target the goal, get shit done kind of way.
Right.
And so therefore my definition of surrender was something out of like a Braveheart movie where it's right. Like surrender. Well, surrender means you're going to have to tear me limb from limb before I acquiesce.
Yeah.
And what I realized probably like, now that I think about it, like a year and a half, 2 years ago, I was just like, that's not going to work for where I'm going next, especially as I was leaning more and more into my feminine. And for everybody who's listening, kind of like a working definition of the feminine has nothing to do with like the gender you identify as. It's just their sources of energy. And for me, it was really around my feminine being, that creative space, that inner knowing. And I know we're definitely going to do an episode on like knowing because that's such a big one, but like that seed of intuition rather than execution. Well, if I was going to lean into my feminine, I was going to need a new definition of surrender.
For sure.
But what I struggled with was if it wasn't like this nice soft version of surrender, which I couldn't quite define at the time, then it felt more like, oh, you're just giving up, which then cast a whole bunch of other like judgments that I have on myself. So yeah, I mean, that's where it started. But to your point, and even as you're talking about it right now, I started asking other people, right? Because I was like, all right, sometimes you don't have all the answers and they're not necessarily dropping in. So let me just kind of poll a bunch of people, not because they're more right than I am, but it's just a matter of like, let me see what everybody else is interpreting this as. So it did bring up a huge line of inquiry. And I want to say that, okay, on this episode, we're going to be really conclusive about this. But the truth is, like, it's still a work in progress, but for good reason.
Yeah, and I think that aligns with this idea of, like, the cyclical action of consistently growing, consistently, like, shedding who we once were before and, like, becoming this new version. So you can listen to this episode now, or you can listen to it, 5 years from now. And our definitions, as well as yours, I'm sure you can agree, Bailey, like everyone is going to continuously change what that means for them at that point in their life.
Yeah,
so
totally.
In this episode, we want to invite you to ask yourself, like, am I surrendering or am I giving up? And what's the difference? Right?
What is the difference? Like, what's my current definition right now? So just as you're like listening, and especially if you're a person who likes to put your thoughts onto paper, just journal that. Just write down like surrender, giving up. What's the difference for you? It's also interesting because I think that when I lean into surrender versus giving up and I look at it from different categories, and these aren't like conclusive categories, but surrender versus giving up in my work, I might approach it a little bit differently than surrender versus giving up when it comes to parenting, or even comes to like love, even comes to like engaging in relationships, whether it's with your family or your friends, right? Where you approach it a little bit different because your definition is working through whatever you're navigating too, right? Like I want to just say, like in love, one might say that surrender is a huge element in terms of like vulnerability and trust, but also the give and take. Like you're going to win sometimes, I'm going to win sometimes. You're going to lose sometimes, I'm going to lose sometimes, but it's not in a tally sheet sort of way. So I think the surrender is, in many ways, in that instance, is kind of like a trusting.
Right. It is. No, and I think that is a perfect kind of segue into like, all right, we can come up with these definitions for surrender and giving up and how they apply to each area of our lives. But what does that really look like when we finally decide to surrender in a situation versus giving up? And I feel like 2020 for me and for so many others has almost forced us into this place of surrendering, realizing that like, you know, I used to be the person that like you could ask me in 3 months at 3 p.m. what are you doing, right? Like, and I would be able to flip in my calendar to that exact day and that exact time and be like, oh, I will be here, right? Like, who else? You know what I mean? Like, so this was how I've always functioned, and it created this place of certainty. It created this safeness and this knowing, right? And then 2020 hit, and, you know, where I am right now is nowhere of where I had originally had in my calendar or planner, but it's how I have responded to it, right? And I could say that I'm completely content and satisfied with where I'm at, knowing that more is to come, right? And this is because I've chosen to not give up, but to surrender, right? Because in this place of giving up, I'm in defeat. I'm a victim, right?
Struggle.
Like I'm struggling.
Yeah, salmon upstream.
Yeah, I can't accept the fact that what I planned to happen at this point in my life is not happening, right? But because I've surrendered, the script has been changed, right? I'm open to what is occurring for me. I've almost fallen into the hands of whatever higher power you believe in, the divine, Earth's plan, whatever the case might be. I've almost fallen into the hands of that and gained this sense of trust in myself and in like whatever this greater energy is, that it's happening for me. When we're in this place of surrender, the script becomes life is happening for me. When we're in this place of giving up, you're the victim of your life. Things are happening to you, right? Like you're not the main character of your story at that point. Someone else is directing it for you, and it's not the film you want to be in.
Right. Which I think like lends to the narrative. That's why like having a working definition of surrender is actually really important.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you're right. We can get stuck in that blender of like, life is happening to me, this is happening to me mentality, which I think more than anything, what it does is it puts us in that like freeze spot, right? Even if we go back to, so Cayla has a background in psychology, I'm a psychotherapist, and I think that sometimes we like to look at it from the perspective of how people are wired. But you know, that fight or flight mode, a lot of times when we're in like freeze, fight, flight, freeze, and we'll freeze, a lot of times that has everything to do with your narrative, right? Because if your narrative says you're going down like the Titanic here, if you have a fight response due to that, like how does that then show up in your life? If you have a flight response where you're just like peace out or stonewall, how does that then show up in your life? Or freeze where you just do nothing at all. And, you know, a great coach in my life who I absolutely love, Jen Flynn, she says, no answer is an answer. No decision is a decision. And although like we sometimes perceive this inactivity to be like putting life on pause is a decision. So when we are talking about surrender, we really also have to be very cognizant of the narrative that's going to drive that.
Right. Yeah, tell me, so there's 2 points in that I think we could really expand on to like kind of bring them deeper into like our thought process. So the first, tell me more about like, I think Jen Flynn's quote was, no answer is an answer, right?
Right. No answer
Tell
is
me
an
more
answer.
about this quote and how that applies and how you can then like implement that by having this kind of narrative.
Right. It's such a good one. It was so impactful for me when she said it. I was just in a really stuck spot in my life. And in many ways, I felt like I was just like, well, I'm just not going to make a decision. I'll see what happens. Got to be very careful with that. Because there's one part of being the observer and you're kind of, taking stock on everything that's going on. I'm going to weigh out my options. But when we don't choose to move forward, like life will happen around us.
Yeah.
And it's not a matter of like the sea parts until you're ready to swim. No, like you're more or less stuck at the brake line and you will be pummeled over. And that's not something to like scare you into like creating a response. But in many ways, like when someone doesn't give you an answer about something in your life, like that is their answer. Like just like it's literally that cut and dry.
Right. No text message back that's the response you needed.
Yeah. You're like, oh, thanks for letting me know.
Yep.
Thanks for letting me know. So it's interesting because probably even as this episode comes out, my definition of surrender will evolve. And like we're talking about surrender right now, but like I also want to invite you to, and we will on future episodes, like how do you define anger? How do you show up in your life when you're sad? Like how do you show up in life when you're happy? Like there's so many different ways we can go about this, but I think it goes back to, are you intentional about the life you're living? And if you are intentional about it, then like let's start to have a working definition of just surrender. Let's just try that one on for size.
Right.
So for me, like right now, and again, like I said, it will evolve as it should because between now and even an hour from now or even tomorrow morning, like I'm going to have experiences that are going to create messages and influences in my life. And that will help me to evolve my perspective and my belief system. So right now, as I'm like thinking about surrender right now, instead of like the Braveheart variety or even like Goonies Never Say Die, which is also what I was working with after I stepped away from being like Mel Gibson, is more like, what would it feel like to float? And not in an inactive way, but that space of being present, allowing, and the intersection, this is what I think is like really sexy, but the intersection
Divine
feminine. But the intersection between how am I feeling and what do I want to do about this? So that's essentially the feminine, right? What am I feeling? And intersecting with the masculine, what do I want to do about this? Because I believe it's pray and move your feet, right? Like pontificate, feel your feelings, and then let's take some action. Let's do something about them.
Yes. I think that also relates to the second point that I wanted to dive deeper into is this idea around the narrative, right? And the reason that I'm thinking this is because you kept mentioning like, well, what are you, telling yourself about the situation? Are you the victim or are you the main character? Who is directing your story? Like, all of these questions. And there's a way that we can, get all of these questions to you guys so that you can continue to dive deeper into them. So we'll get into that. But the narrative piece that I think is important is, like you were saying, like, what are you going to do about it? Like, if your narrative is negative self-talk, if you feel that you can't conquer the world, if you don't feel that you're able to take that next step into your next shift in your life or whatever the case might be, like, what are you telling yourself, right? And instead of, we were just kind of speaking on this, like, instead of ignoring whatever that is and just like, oh, I'm confident, I'm proud, I can do anything, right? Like, acknowledge your ego, acknowledge the negative self-talk, like, have compassion for that piece of yourself, like, show up with love and say, why am I thinking this way? Unpack that. Because if not, like you said, we're constantly evolving. That means you're going to be presented with another situation that is going to trigger that same emotion, that same negative self-talk.
Right.
And if we're talking about evolving and leveling up here, we've got to like squash the old stuff and like really kind of like detach ourselves, cut all cords from those negative things and those negative thoughts. And when we do that, it's about unpacking it, having compassion for that version of yourself, because so many times you'll hear, motivational speakers and podcasts talk about like just in general having a better way to think about yourself, right? Like it's all about positivity and those things. Like, yes, here for it all, right? Like you can do anything you set your mind to. But if your mind is telling you and your self-talk is negative and it's hard for you to truly deep down in your heart and gut believe in that, you've got to uproot what those things are.
Yeah. I mean, truth is garbage in, garbage out. If your head is garbage, life is garbage. I know. It's like the Jersey girl coming at me. I'm like, it's all going down. But the truth is, like, there are times when, we need to be in that space of balance. And here's what I want to toss over to you is like the difference between inner knowing versus, and I'm going with a straight up versus, but versus like just keep forcing it. Just keep forcing it versus that place of inner knowing where you're like, okay, I know that I need to relax into this, or okay, I know that I need to give this up, or okay, I know that I need to, like, whatever you need to do. But so I think that goes hand in hand with what you're just saying about the narrative, is it positive or negative?
Yes.
So, but what I'm balancing out here is inner knowing versus that forcing. I can make it happen. I just need a little bit further, a little bit longer. And again, there are times when you do need to push through. But I don't think that you can truly know when you need to push through unless you are tapped into your inner knowing.
Yeah. And I think, short version is like my go-to line, just do what feels good to you. Right?
Right. Is it that simple?
Right. But when you say that, like, that's a question in itself. Like, do what feels good to me. Well, what genuinely feels good to me? Because we can talk about being tapped in and this inner knowing and our intuition and all those things. And like, so many people may not even understand how to get to that place. So in short, do what feels good to you. And when you start to think that way and ask yourself in every situation, does this feel good to me? That's how you start to get into this place of like your inner knowing. You're opening yourself up for inquiry versus taking the stimulus around you and making decisions, right? Like you're asking yourself verbally the question, like, do I want to do this right now? And you'll feel it either in your gut or you're in your heart. Like you'll feel, wherever you feel it in your body, that's the response, right, to like what you should do in the situation. When something's not going well, you feel it in your stomach, right? That weight on your chest in other situations. Our body responds to things like this. So this idea of, kind of like tapping into this inner knowing, it's almost easier said than done, right? Like there's levels to it.
Right.
And it's not like impossible for anyone, but you have to start somewhere. And that's why I say, in short, you have to do what feels good to you. And by doing what feels good to you and knowing you're constantly evolving, right? Like that's going to change. That's when surrender happens.
True.
Because you're constantly evolving. You're never going to be the same person, right? So if you're continuously asking yourself what feels good to me, what felt good to you a month ago may not be the case anymore. Now you're surrendering and you're taking action on what feels good to you versus what you wrote in your planner and what was originally on your to-do list. Right.
No, I think that you're 100% right. And I think that I think this is a really great time for a little story time, right? Because I think that, at least in my mind, we can wax lyrical about theory and we can also like talk about the wiring behind it and the why behind it. And I know you said before that we were going to share with them a great resource for them.
Yes.
Go ahead.
All right. So we've been talking so much about questions, right? Like what feels good to you and how do you define struggling and these idea of like negative self-talk and all of these types of things, right? Like tons and tons of questions we've literally been throwing at you from the beginning of this episode.
Right, because it's like you need to reflect in order to grow. Like every day can be Groundhog Day if you just get up and do the same thing. And I think that in many ways, like we have been indoctrinated into this like being on a hamster wheel of life, almost being a good thing. Like how routine are you? And it's like, well, hold up a second. How introspective are you?
Yeah.
Like, are you actually growing?
Right. Yeah, so I think, and in this place of like, again, so many questions, like to be able to grow, we have to be able to, story time, really short. We have to become friends with and have compassion for the previous versions of ourselves, right? Like who we were before and who we're going to be in the future. And this is that place of self-reflection. So, on this podcast, we're having tons of questions, being answered, but also posing a ton of questions to you. And we want you guys to be able to have a place where you can resort back to those questions, right? Pull your journal out. If you're on a walk, if you're in the car, like we do not expect you to have the answers to these off the top of your head. Sit with these, unpack them. So in order to do that, we've got our free reflection questions and our journal prompts. And B, I know you've been excited about all of these questions coming out and the community we've been building here. So we want to be able to share it with you as well. So all you have to do, it's so simple. Pull your phone out, go to your text messages, right? And you're going to type in 732-487-3404 and just text us your favorite emoji, right? And when they do that, they're going to get all of these questions, all of the reflection questions, all of our updates, exclusive offers, because what you're doing is you're anchoring in this idea that you're ready to grow. You're ready to step into this next level by asking yourself the questions that matter. So to get those free reflection questions, head to your text messages, type in 732-487-3404 and text us your favorite emoji.
Well, it's like we had this idea about doing the community a while ago. And one of the things that I thought was most powerful about it, and also like where I get stuck sometimes, is we talk about journal to reflect, or even meditate, which is a whole different episode. But like sometimes the easiest way to journal is when I have a journal prompt, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
When it's like, okay.
Some people don't know what to say or what to write.
Or like really intimidated by a blank page. I get it. I've been there. Even if you are a regular journaler, like sometimes we just need to get out of our own head and be posed to different questions that help us to grow. So I'm super excited about community. Listen to Cayla, do what she said to do, and join us in community. So back to story time.
Yes.
Okay. So real deal instances when you've had to like face down in the mud, really decide if you were in a space of surrender or giving up. And I know you gave a great example before about, you made a plan for 2020, right? And then like life happened. And actually like having witnessed you in this last year, I'd say life probably happened even better than you had planned in your planner. Not that we're not advocating planning, because I'm a big fan of planning.
Yes, but being able to like take events and like shift them months ahead of time or months later, right? Depending on what shows up for you. Right.
So for me, story time. So years ago when I was working like a crazy person, I had the dream job, working in a school district. I had my private practice as a psychotherapist. I was working with at-risk youth. And like, I was working like a crazy person, like 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a day, or excuse me, a week. And I was exhausted, but it's like, here I was helping all the people, right? And then I started to, and it's a long story, but like I started to get panic attacks. I would wake up in the middle of the night, those like, 3 a.m. What am I doing with my life sweats? I would be driving actually from the school district to my private practice office, which was always my dream. Like I went to school to become a therapist. I like then became a therapist, and we're talking like leather couch, waterfall feature, like all the things that a therapist's office has. And I arrived, and it wasn't that long until I was like, get me out of here. But because I was doing the thing that I always wanted to do, that I went to school for, that I like followed the exact steps for, I felt like I made my bed and now I have to lie in it. So I felt like I just needed to stay where I was and it would get better eventually. And it wasn't that I didn't like the work that I was doing. It was just like there was something else out there for me, and it was like calling to me, screaming to me, but I didn't know what the hell it was. So that was really scary. So here I am in a space of like living the life that I thought I always wanted to. And like on paper, this looks good, right? It's like you have the house, you've got the job, you've got the, the partner, all those things. And inside, like everything in you is screaming like, this isn't it, this isn't it, this isn't it, this isn't it.
Yeah.
To the point where your body starts to react. And for me at that point, it was a real struggle between, it felt like if I made any changes, I would be giving up, right? Giving up what I worked so hard for. But it was also coming down to a point where if I didn't make any changes, like, it's a long story and you guys can read it in my book, Own Your Power, but like, I went to the doctor. I was suffering from adrenal fatigue. I wasn't getting pregnant. We were trying to get pregnant. I couldn't get pregnant. My body was in like a fight or flight mode all the time.
System shut down,
right? But here I am, right? The Instagram version was like, everything's smiling, like great job, great everything, wait list, the whole thing. But the truth was inside, like, I didn't know what the hell I wanted to do with myself. So it was hard at that time. Like making any changes felt like giving up. But eventually what I found was that as I started to take better care of myself, I heard this voice of like more of a surrender. And when it came out, it was more like curiosity and openness and willingness. And don't get me wrong, it was scary as all hell.
Yeah.
I mean, this company wouldn't exist. This podcast wouldn't exist. None of this would exist had I not started to listen to those whispers. And Kay, it's really scary when you're trying to do that, because the truth is, I had no other plan, zero other plan. And when you go from, and I know you get this, and I'm sure other people listening is like, yes, sister speaks for me. But like when you go from being the like, here's the syllabus, do all the things on the syllabus, and then even in the track of being a psychotherapist, like you do and you study, and then you have 1,920 hours of supervision, like you do all the things, or you climb the corporate ladder, whatever the deal is. When you're following the to-do checklist and you know that that's not your fit, but you don't know what the hell else is. Like, could somebody have just given me a different syllabus?
Right.
Like, let me follow that. Where's the blueprint? It was scary, but it was that, goes back to that inner knowing. Inner knowing. So how about for you? Like, can you think of a time when just like you really struggle with the push-pull of the inner story around giving up versus surrender, and you made a choice? Well, either way, it can be a good story, a bad story. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like so I have always been someone who likes a plan to avoid scarcity and lack. Right? So I like to plan knowing that I have it together, because sometimes I've been surrounded by people who don't have it together. Right? And it's this sense of comfort that like, if they don't have it figured out, well then I've got to make sure I've got it together. Right?
Right.
So that's why I've always been such a planner. I've always been so strict with my schedule. I was like a senior in high school and friends would want to hang out with me and I'd be like, let me check my planner. Like, I mean, old soul. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is how I've
like
always...
80.
This is literally how I've always... And I'm not... Like, there's no wrinkles here. I am not 80.
All right, listen.
In my heart is, right? Like, I think I've done this a few times.
Done a couple of lifetimes, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
So, really, like, I was always that person. Like, my friends would want to hang out with me and let me check my planner. But it was because I didn't want to disrupt everything else that I had going on. As you were speaking about the inner knowing, I mean, this wasn't even what I was originally going to tell story-wise, because I can talk super current in, like, 2020, how my life has shifted, right? And for the better in ways that I would have never expected. But I'm thinking, like, small example, kind of relating to jobs. When I was in college, I was an RA for the entire time that I was there. And I was an RA so that I didn't have to pay more money to go to school. Not because I wanted to be one. Scarcity and lack.
Right? Yeah, right.
So I'm taking this job on and I talked myself into it. I mean, the experiences that I gained from it, I'm forever grateful for. This is that idea of realizing life is happening for me. Did I originally want to become an RA? No. Could I have been denied the position when I applied? Of course, but that's not what happened, right? I got the job. So there was obviously experiences in that were meant for me to have. So, you know, for 3 years I was an RA, and the things that I witnessed and experienced, but the impact that I also was able to make was really, really transformational for me, as well as the residents that I was around. And, you know, the friendships that I've created through this position will forever be, you know, close to my heart. And I think where this inner knowing stepped in was when I came back to this place of like, why I had to do it. Why did I take this position? And I didn't want to do it anymore, right? I went into my senior year and I was like, can I have like one normal year of college, right? Like, part of the college experience just doesn't exist when you're an RA, because you have to be that perfect role model. You're considered a college official, right? So that, and me being an old soul, there was sometimes I wanted to just be in my 20s, like, and have those experiences. But I had to be the role model, as I am at home, you know, being the oldest of 5 siblings, right? So I've always been playing this part, and I knew that I didn't want that position anymore. And this is complete, you know, vulnerability. And like, I didn't put my all into my last application, right, to be an RA, because I didn't want it anymore. But there was still a piece of me that was operating out of scarcity and lack, because I still applied. Because if I got it, then that's less money that I have to pay, right? So when I did that, I almost, and, you know, because I didn't fill my application out to the best of my ability for this last year of, being in college and becoming an RA, I didn't get the position. And it was almost like intentional. Like I set myself up for this one. But where the surrender came in at was when I had to step into the Office of Residential Life and they told me, you didn't get your position back, right? I could have went and tried to like pushed for the position because I knew that it would save me money in the future. And like, that's the reason I did it from the beginning was so I could save money, right? But I decided not to. And if anything, it was like, thank you for this experience. Listen to my inner knowing, sending, all of my love, and stepped out of the office. That's where the surrender took place because I could have continued to operate out of this place of scarcity and lack and fear.
Right.
That I would have, had to pay more money or whatever the case was. And money for a lot of people is the reason that they don't make these big life shifts and life changes because they're comfortable. And how am I going to make a living doing something else, right? Like, how am I ever going to have the money if I, leave my 9-to-5 and take on another venture in life? So for me to take that step back and surrender and, I don't know how I'm going to pay for this last year of school, but I know I don't want to be an RA. It's going to work out, right? Fast forward, everything's virtual, didn't even have to pay for campus living. The universe always delivers, right? I'm not even at school to have to worry about room and board.
Right. Well, no, but I think you make a good point is, there's multiple instances in our lives that we can kind of look at, like, where am I trying to swim upstream and I'm struggling? Where do I need to just let go? And what would let go afford me? Like, in terms of our quality of life. So, as we talked about today, we threw to you guys a lot of questions. Yeah. A lot of questions. But our intention is to throw those questions to you because the quality of our life is really determined on the questions that we're asking ourselves. So dive in, enjoy, re-listen, share as much as you want. Maybe pass this episode on to a friend that you're just like, hey, let's talk about this, because that's all it is. It's a matter of having those points within our mind that we start to look at life a little bit differently, shift, open up that aperture of our mind.
Right. And anchoring that in with your own community, asking, like we said in the beginning of this episode, I went home and had conversation with people about this. Like, guys, screenshot this episode, put it to your Instagram story, tag us at the Mindrise, and just type in, anchor it in with us. I'm surrendering, right? Like, just throw it on your Instagram, tag at the Mindrise, so we know that you're anchoring into surrendering and allowing what's meant for you to come your way. You don't want to be blocking that. So anchor it in, have those conversations with your family at home. Like, what is the difference between giving up and surrendering?
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, a rising tide lifts all ships.
Exactly.
Bye, guys.